Good morning, everyone. Welcome to CDU's Don't Panic seminar series. This is the second seminar in a row. Uh, and thanks everyone who is joining today, and there'll be more people joining in due course, I guess. Uh, my name is Akhilesh Surjan. I am a team leader and associate professor in Humanitarian Emergency and Disaster Management area at the College of Indigenous Futures, Arts and Society at CDU. I would like to start with uh, acknowledging the country. I would like to acknowledge that this seminar is being held on the traditional lands of the Larakia people, and we pay our respect to elders past, present, and emerging. I would like to offer a brief introduction to the speaker, Dr. Jonatan Lassa, who is working at CDU as Senior Lecturer in Humanitarian Emergency and Disaster Management Area Studies. He's a multidisciplinary person. He started his career by getting training in civil engineering in Indonesia. So he's a trained civil engineer. Uh, Later on, he went on uh, to do further studies in UK with the University of East Anglia, where he did his master's in environment and development. Returning from UK, he worked in Indonesia with a number of stakeholders, and including his very intensive engagement following the tsunami of 2004. Later on, his engagement led him to further inquiries in the academic discipline of disaster management, and which took him to Germany, and where he joined the University of Bonn and the United Nations University, where he did his PhD. And following that, he also spent a considerable time at the Harvard University for doing his postdoctoral fellowship. Prior to joining CDU in 2016, he was working with the top university in Singapore, Nanyang University of Technology (NTU), and he has intensive and extensive experience of working in Southeast Asian region on variety of issues, including disaster management, adaptation to climate change, environmental degradation, non-profit sector engagement in risk reduction, risk governance, and so on. Uh, with this brief introduction, I would like to invite now Dr. Lassa for his lecture.
Right. Thank you very much, Professor Surgeon. Good morning, everyone. Good morning from Darwin. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge that this seminar is being held on the traditional lands of the Larakia people and pay our respects to elder past, present, and emerging. Right. So I'm going to talk a little bit about COVID-19 and crisis leadership from around the world. I call it an early observation. Let me begin. So probably we start from a crisis first. This is how we do it in my crisis leadership classes that I often teach here at CDU since my arrival in 2016. Now, the crisis is, crisis defined differently by different people. And sometimes we get into a necessary debate on, what is the difference between crisis, disasters, catastrophic calamities. This is like some of the qualities that leaders need to perform differently during what is so-called as normal times. So in here, we can actually define a crisis as a moment when we can see existential risk of an agency or society or even the leaders themselves. Or you can also argue that it's a kind of transitional phases during which normal ways of operating the public space is no longer work. So we have been listening to these kind of statements like desperate times, you need desperate measures, or drastic times you need drastic measures. And uh, I just realized that this is coming from Hippocrates, um, millenniums ago, 2 millenniums ago, or probably less than 2 million. And then in 16th century, we've been also listening to this extreme evil, extreme remedy, and there is the Greek version of it as well. So I argue that it's not a new thing if we want to argue that way. Crisis leadership has been performed throughout the course of human society. And to my surprise, that after teaching this unit at CDU, or this course at CDU, I just realized that crisis leadership is not something that is um, a subject, like a regular subject for investigation. Most of the studies have been done uh, very recently, and there are only a few books that has been around, um, and one of them is written by a consultant or government advisor. It's Tim Johnson, who tried to provide and argue a little bit different uh, than others. He tried to define crisis leadership as the ability of leaders to show different leadership competency, um, but rather to display the same competency under the extreme pressure that characterizes a crisis, namely uncertainty, high levels of emotion, the need for swift decision making, and at times intolerable external scrutiny. And in this, um, uh, it is in this that crisis leadership will be seen as success or kind of failed. Um, this is a very interesting book. It just came out like 2, 3 years ago. I bought it from Google Books. And I found that it's quite interesting because this guy wrote from uh, the heaps of years of experience, being one of the advisor of one governor in one of the states in the United States of America. Now, I still think that um, there are, I think the world needs more books on crisis leadership because of what you have been observing around the world from different levels, from your probably local municipalities, your cities, and probably your own presidents in your countries. You might ask some questions. Um, but before we move into that, let's ask these questions. Why this is so important? Well, it's for obvious reasons. Crisis leadership is about life and death decision making. So if you delays in decision, it could lead to huge consequences. And look at the case of COVID-19 now. If you delay your decision to contain the spread of the virus, the economic consequences is probably unmanageable up to some degree. So in the context today, we want to exercise some kind of crisis leadership in order to be able to reduce escalations of losses and damages. And by doing that, hopefully we could actually prevent some degree of economic collapse. Now, as I mentioned before, crisis leadership is a marginal kind of field of research. Uh, the reason because there is huge gap of literature on this topic. I think that in the last 15, 20 years, we got only maximum 10 books on this topic. Some of the book have been pretty old, and new experiences coming up, and most of the books have been written from the US context or European context. And even in the humanitarian communities, in my field, we deal with different type of communities. One is emergency service communities in specific state and territories or in specific country. And you have also disaster risk reduction communities. These people are kind of trying to get things done pre-emergencies. And also we have also another communities. It's called humanitarian communities that operates globally. And to my surprise, the literature on humanitarian leadership is so limited at this point of time. And this is simple. This has happened because humanitarian studies do not think leadership studies as their own thing. And leadership studies don't think that we have to think too much on, how a leader performs during a certain crisis. I've been trying to connect with some of the leadership scholars in management schools from the down south in Australia. And from my engagement, I come to realize that this crisis leadership topic is something that is not seen as, uh, an urgent kind of thing that should be shared with students. But if you look around what happens right now, we have kind of global collective leadership failures that could have actually prevented the COVID from being spread uh, widely to across probably 100 of 190 or even more countries around the world. There is lack of written case studies on leadership, apart from colleagues at Harvard Kennedy schools who often produce how leaders perform under certain crises, disasters, or even um, um, catastrophic kind of events. So I think one of the reasons why that is the case, because as I argued, humanitarian communities kind of remain focused on life-saving projects, and they don't really have the time to think that this is repeated games where actors can develop better strategy for a long-term game. When I said actors here is kind of leaders that we need to think about. So, and most of the case studies simply focus on what leaders should do and can do in crisis A, B, and C. So there is also lack of theories of crisis leadership. Most of the theories are on crisis leadership is actually grounded on the norms of what should be done in crisis time and performed by leaders. So we don't have much kind of theoretical framework to think about this up until probably 2 years ago. Some scholars from Netherlands have been trying to come up with certain frameworks and concepts and also theories on how we could actually evaluate crisis leadership. And I'll be sharing with you some of them in the next few minutes. Right. Now, most of the literature argue the same thing. The crisis is kind of moving targets. So crisis leadership is like shooting at something that is not static. So I never shoot apart from playing. Playing with kids, But even when you try to shoot the static targets, it's not easy. Let alone it's a moving target. So let's argue that this is not a simple exercise. This is something that needs to be learned and then master it. Now, the question is, how can we assess leadership performance during a crisis? How can we do that? And what can we reasonably expect from leaders at the strategic or political level during the times of disasters? Because we, as the audience, in that I'll be using a theory where public will be treated as kind of audience, and leaders are the performers. And so some of the questions is how important is their role in crisis, or how important it is their role as crisis managers. Now, this is one of the framework from Arjen Bowen from Netherlands, who have been trying to come up with some framework. I think Arjen Bowen, Paul Hart, and some of his PhD students, including collaborators like Walter Young, I think they have been one of the first people in Europe who have been consistently work on crisis leadership. In the US context, we have Naim Capuccio, but we have also probably Dutch, Leonard Dutch at Kennedy School, and also probably a few colleagues from different parts of the US. In Australia, we don't have much. I think apart from Kristen Owen at the University of Tasmania, we don't have much people on this. And in Southeast Asia, to my surprise, it's kind of an empty field. And that's the reason why I've been trying to come up with something that could probably be used to explain how leaders in Southeast Asia behave under crisis, whether it's public health crisis, whether it's tsunamis, or whether it is post-earthquakes events or post-cyclone events in Southeast Asia. I have been trying to collect some of them. And one of the framework that we could use is what Arjen Bowen has clusters, crisis leadership assessment framework. Let me drink first. So this is pretty basic. It's not really 101 crisis leadership, but it's some pretty basic features of crisis leadership. That as a leader, you have to be able to create the systems that you take a crisis. It's kind of early warning systems where early detection of a crisis can be identified. So we ask the questions where early warning systems or early detections exist. And the second thing that we need to ask whether we have sense-making exercises that are in place in government office. In this case, we talk about the presidential office, we talk about the premier, we talk about the governors, and even you can apply these into business institutions like big firms. And so it's kind of U-curve here. We try to ask some of the questions how leaders make critical decisions and timely. How this is considered in their decision making, and whether is there any coordination mechanism from vertical to horizontal landscape in the public institutions exists or not. And they also propose what is called as coupling and decoupling, which is, I don't think, a little bit crucial, but I'll explain that if we have time. But one of the key features of crisis leadership is you have to think about how leaders create meanings throughout their performance. So throughout the stages of crisis. So if you think about crisis as a kind of an emerging event, and then it emerges into something that is still manageable, but then it continues into something that is kind of outbreak. When you talk about like COVID-19, from outbreak, and then it transforms into epidemic, and then it goes into pandemic. So in every stage, you can see how leaders trying to calm their population, how they try to calm down their citizens using different strategies, different tricks, different techniques, and try to bring some meanings in that. And some of them are not quite good. Some of them are terrible because the meaning that they try to produce is counterproductive and sometimes lack legitimacy. As we can also think about how leaders create their communication systems. Um, this is especially crucial at this point of time. I'll be sharing in the last slides why we collapse. I mean, why the global is kind of failed to address the COVID-19. And one of the problem is the way the leaders create their own communication systems as well. And what about accountability? And what about the learning systems from the events? So it's not a global practice when it comes to learning from the events, because I think in many Southeast Asian countries, I'm not sure about if the Singapore, uh, learning is not a common practice. So it's pretty hard to find out how governments generate learnings after certain events. Um, and let alone how they use the learning to inform future resilience strategy. We often find that these three elements, accountability, learning, and enhancing the resilience agenda after the event, is quite like in many parts of the world. And some, we could actually argue that some of this happened because of lack of resources to do that, or probably lack of human resources to produce that kind of learning. Now, let's move a little bit from Aryan Boyne here. So in this, I try to elaborate some of the elements that Aryan Boyne talk about. So when it comes to early warning systems, we go back to the way we create the systems that, some people call it early warning systems, but the terminology of early warning system has become pretty rigid, so people don't think that this is like, it's kind of seen as technical right now. So in public policy stage, some language has been used. It's kind of crisis detection language of term that has been used by some of the social scientists and also management scientists. So some of the question is, are the systems in place to detect an early sign of a crisis? And how do leaders create conditions that facilitate this kind of preparedness? These questions are important, but it's important to raise these questions before the disasters. Otherwise, it will be kind of too late. Now, one of the second important steps that Aryan Boyne suggests is sense making. In other words, it's kind of creating situational awareness. So the question is how leaders inform their situational awareness, or how leaders conduct their sense making procedures or exercise. Now, in this case, we talk about leaders and what they should do, including understand the scales and complexity of an event or potential events, and how they could actually engage multi-stakeholder involvements, not only their own team of advisors that very often say yes, boss kind of thing. We need different opinions in this particular time, because nobody get all the knowledge and control over what is going to happen. So nobody can function alone. You have to engage all the stakeholders, including media. And in this case, we know that by nature, leaders do not have long mental span, because they have heaps of agenda on their tables, they have different priorities. So how can we capitalize some kind of mental span of their leaders so they can actually pay attention to what we are going to say if we serve them as an advisor in emergency services or in governor's office or in the presidential office. And we also need to also ask these questions whether some of the functions of the public institution have been compromised to some degree. And Aryan Boyne argued that we need to have some kind of well-rehearsed methods to process information, share it with the right people, consider their feedback, create an understandable dynamic pictures, and analyze what could happen next and what are the consequences, and try to formulate the specific information for the leaders. In this case, we talk about sense making as not as something that is done entirely by the leaders themselves, but we're talking about some kind of backstages where you have somebody advising the leaders on what needs to be done next. Now, decision making has been the central part of this study. We want to see how leaders make decisions, whether it's operational decision or strategic decision. And some of the questions have been related to how much resources is available. Are there any gaps at which level? And how do leaders make priorities under resource constraint? So very often resource dependent kind of planning after disaster is performed. And that could actually delay some of the response. So the way we could do that in the context of COVID, I think many governments in especially developing world, low-income countries, this is actually what happened. So you do the plan based on your resources rather than based on what is needed, and whether we can find balance in between. That is some of the questions. But one of the key suggestion is also probably we don't have to be acting too fast. Let's give some time to think, buy some time, and try to think about what kind of decisions can get better acceptance, and what are tough decisions that is necessary but probably will not be well received. Or sometimes people rejected your idea simply because of the framing of your policy. Like the use of public health emergency sounds like softer than civil emergency, or the declaration of national disasters. So try this kind of framing, and that should be part of the decision making. And I think leaders should be advised about this particular decision, and weighing the decision, like whether you need some kind of centralization because of the time. So the central government can kind of trying to jump into the space and arguing that this is the time where you can take decision. Of course, it's not easy to be done in some of the highly decentralized kind of federal systems, but it is possible to be done in some of the countries, like in Asia. It's easily to be done in the Philippines, Indonesia, and China. And one of the things that I think is very important is leaders need to be also able to identify no regret approaches. So no regret approaches suggest that not all the things that needs to be done, we know there is, but we know that if you delay, the risk will be higher. So we could actually identify some of the actions that need to be done early on without waiting for complete and perfect information, because in times of crisis, it doesn't exist. Because it's quite complex. So when it comes to coordination, and you will be bored if you study crisis leadership and disaster management, because coordination is coming in almost every papers why things fail on the ground. But let's emphasize this again, that coordination means you connect resources, you connect people, you connect different types of communities. But before doing that, you need to be aware that this is kind of, if you don't have a pre-disaster preparedness systems where things can be rehearsed and drillings can be repeated, very often you will meet strangers in your response. And what you could do is kind of stranger sociality approach. So what happened is you just say hi, but the problems to everyone, but the problem is trust might not be there. So you have to spend some time of building trust while create your coordination systems and making sure that everybody benefiting from your coordination system is not only like your office or somebody or certain groups that benefit from them. And in coordination, you need to also be persuasive rather than using the command control approach. Of course, again, desperate time, desperate measures. So you have to equally weighing when you have to use this command control model and in what kind of stage you have to do that. Because you cannot simply use command control model in all the contexts, especially also in democratic world. It's pretty hard to do that. And in one of the things that I think missing from the moment, especially COVID-19, because some of the communities keep doing some, it's pretty hard to ask communities to stop do the usual thing, social distancing is something like very counterintuitive because for millennia, humans exist in this kind of social relations. And at this point of time, somehow we have to stop all these things. So as a result, people think that community is part of the problems. But I think at this point of time, we need to identify how communities organize themselves and create a structure among themselves and sustain that kind of measures in order to contain, let's say, COVID-19 in their neighborhoods. And of course, we need to think about coordination in different systems. Again, whether it is you need to create some kind of central model or decentralizing model. This kind of discussion has been extensively discussed in our field, in disaster management field. Now, what needs to be done is reducing complexity and uncertainty. So leaders need to monitor the progress and understand how the system actually works. And it's pretty hard to expect them to know this kind of knowledge in kind of high degree, but I'm talking about, is there any system for leaders to be able to reduce this kind of complexity? And complexity arises because we think that, because the knowledge that we have in hands is probably no longer relevant. Well, it's still relevant, but I mean, the complexity is just quite big, where some of the knowledge that we have is kind of not convincing enough to be used to inform the next policy steps. So some of the things that in the last 10 years or so, probably 20 years, the science of complexity from social science and also from computer science, physics, social network analysis, quantitative social science, I've been trying to come up with this approach where we could actually help leaders to understand about systems and interlinked systems and try to understand its parts, the hubs, the subsystems, the sub networks, and asking the question, can we create a few systems and allow them to fail while protecting the big structure of the society? And this is, of course, theoretically speaking, but in the real life, we know very often that if we want to create certain kind of decision making around which kind of sections of the road or transportation network needs to be failed while others allowed to operate, I think it's kind of not really generic, but it's kind of something that we get used to it. Now, meaning making is one part of the things that I'm going to touch at the end of this talk again. So, but let me briefly explain. So I take this concept from the paper of Arjen Bowen and Paul Hart in their The Politics of Crisis Management. It's published in 2005 and it's still, I think, one of the best books that is available for most of the students. And they have been also publishing lots of articles around this. So we go back to the current state of the art of governments, where in many cases we think that government is kind of the paternal institutions where public wait for them to hear what they are going to say, what they're going to do, what they're planning to do with us in times of trying, in times of crisis. And of course, there are too many data to handle in times of crisis. The question is how you get a big picture of the events. And in that sense, we ask the questions how you create an authentic hope and confidence um, that in a way can reduce uncertainty and provide authoritative account on what is going on and why it is happening and what needs to be done and why everybody should be able to listen. So if you have been trying to watch some of the leaders around the world in the last 15 years, one of the leaders of my favorite is Barack Obama. Barack Obama is quite knowledgeable and very much aware of what is to be said in times of crisis. I'm sure that is because because his team behind him is also so capable. But there are others players in this space that we can also look for examples. And they're not necessarily famous leaders. Some of them are very infamous, but perform quite well in crisis situation. And that happens during George Bush before the 9/11, and then he performed very well in that event, even though some people also, the same people criticize how he performed not quite well or probably bad during Katrina 2005. So the challenge is how readers create compelling stories. And that's quite simple. You tell the stories about what is crisis about, what is actually at stake, what causes it, and what can be done, and what we know so far. If you look at the speeches from Barack Obama, he has all the normative kind of components in his speeches. And that's because they know how to frame it in a better way that in a way can create the legitimacy of the leaders. Now I'll try to deal with this later on in the last slides. And of course, communication is needed. I think I'll check my time first, whether we still have time. Okay, so it's almost 40 minutes. I'll just skip the communication because I know everybody knows about communication is important. I'll touch on this a little bit on how you create rituals to reconnect with citizens and to lower the possibility of impacts of blame games in aftermath of disasters. And this has been written by Walter Young from Netherlands. And I think if you look at the New Zealand Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, she has been able to play this kind of variables in quite authentic way, and that's why many people praise her during the mosque shooting last year, and also I think some of the others during COVID-19 this year. Now I'll skip this. Accountability, I think I will skip this because of the time. Learning, I think I highlighted a little bit already. We need to systematically create learning from every crisis, and we expect every governments in the world can do this. Otherwise, all the events will go without we could actually learn much about that. And also leaders need to create future resilience agenda. I think I will skip this and some of the challenges in the world context. I think I'll also create this, but I'll touch on the single versus interagency structure of response. So unlike in Australia, where I've been following some of the states in here, and most of the structure is you have clear role who is actually leading. But in some of the countries like Indonesia at the moment is not quite clear when it comes to structure. So what is actually happening is you have interagency structures of response, and sometimes this interagency display different style of leadership, different information, and sometimes the informations are conflicting. And that happens also in some of the countries, but I think we are running off of the time, so I'll probably keep it for the next. Now, some remarks in here. And this is based on my work at the moment. It's a work in progress. For a very long time, leadership studies, especially crisis leadership, we treat disasters or crises as fields where leaders operate. That is quite true, but there is an alternative views on that. And I used to share that kind of view when I arrived here 4 years ago. Because I didn't really prepare that crisis leadership will be kind of my field. I used to take a course on this and fascinated by the topics because I studied disaster governance, and one point of governing and governability is leadership. But I didn't know that I will be finally doing some kind of research on this. And COVID-19 is just one part of it that creates some kind of excitement, because when I arrived here, I thought that crisis leadership is not a sprint. It's not a short distance kind of exercise. It's a marathon. It's a long distance. So you need to keep your energy to think about how you perform from one event to the next, because within the big events that call crisis, you have heaps of rituals that you need to carry on. And some of these rituals can be performed better as we going forward, despite of the fact that you might start it poorly, or some leaders might start it poorly. But also you have to also pay attention that you could actually start perfectly, but overrun it in a way that in the end kind of got fail because of some of the variables might not be satisfied. So I have been fascinated by Erving Goffman. I'm not a trained sociologist. I have been long secret admirer of sociology. So I keep often, I very often suddenly my English runs out. I'll drink first. So one of the sociologists that I admire is Erving Goffman. And this book is based on his PhD dissertation, the presentation of self in everyday life. So basically, he tries to code and decode human behavior in the real world. And given his exposure to acting and filmography, I think to some degree, a few years before he started moving to academic career, that allows him to look at the real world as kind of stage, it's for him is no different between acting and also the real world life. I think you could imagine yourself about getting up in the morning and try to present yourself in front of your lovers or your kids or your parents And of course, then you go to the office and you have different audience, and you have to behave in different ways. You have to use your clothes a different way. You have to actually present yourself in total different way as you change audience. So that is the basic theory, and of course there's heaps of that. And while preparing this, I suddenly hit a Facebook page where Justin Bieber trying to find his true self because of his struggles with the life, being grown up in the face of the whole world, and how he uh, performed in a way. Um, he kind of got into identity crisis. So this uh, finding true self is kind of everybody's journey. We want to find true self. But the interesting part of Goffman theory is it's questionable whether we can actually develop one true self for ourselves. And this is some of the framework that he invented. And he called it dramaturgical lenses, or lenses is my word, but it's kind of dramaturgical kind of framework that allow us to look at ourselves and also our leaders. So here is the summary of it. Let's say that leaders play different roles as humans do in many times, and very often they are inconsistent. And why they are inconsistent? Because the person is not simply inconsistent, but because the audience changed. So you have to actually adjust. And in this case, humans and also leaders often juggle the mask. So there is no true self. What we have is only mask that we change from one audience to the others. And that is what personal should be used. So the question is, what kind of personal or what kind of characteristics should be used in a particular audience? So keep in mind, imagine one of the leaders, or try yourself to be imagining as a leader and asking this kind of questions. And very often they try to control the way they appear, and staging as part of it. And for very simple reason, we do set up ourselves in the best light in front of our audience or participation, or in this case, the public. So he also called what is called as interaction rituals and the face work. And the face work is, the face and the facement is the same thing. So sometimes you create a kind of narrative, he calls it lines, during your speech, but then a critical journalist asks you a very tough questions and your face changes, and it's called kind of defacement, and then you have to find ways to face again, like in the stage. So in Goldman's view, there is no true self, and the true identity that leaders should be kind of perfect, like noble defined kind of qualities, is nonsense, because what is really important is the mask at that particular time, rather than finding the true self. So impression management and audience dependent performance in times of crisis is matter most, rather than creating these kind of ideals that leaders is kind of one guy, that the self continuity keeps present itself consistently in different part of the audience. It's never true, according to Goffman. And I think to some degree, we also think that, we try to compare Donald Trump and Jacinda Ardern, and try to construct that Donald is a bad guy and then Jacinda is a good girl, to Goffman, this is not that important. And I mean, in what matters in public space and leadership, you need to be aware and should be able to do this impression management. So forget about yourself as a kind of being seen as a bad boy or good girls, bad girls. What is important is you need to create impression management systems. And there are some of the terms that probably you guys can learn later. It's called lines. Line is kind of the narratives or your speech, your statements that connects to your face when you talk about in a press conference. And there is a rituals behind this kind of order of expressions. And that is given the function of the situation and also your audience. Of course, if the audience is mixed, you have some poor fellows out there that expect you to behave differently, but you have also your business communities that you need to attend to, and they have different needs, they have different agenda. Sometimes this kind of impression management gets more challenged, and that is the art of leadership to me. And so, in brief, I argued that in crisis contexts, leaders can perform at front stage by creating certain kind of impression management strategy, like being a con artist, be manipulative to some degree in a way that create the legitimacy of yourself as a leader, but also at the same time the governments, because you need this kind of capital in order to be able to govern the society through the tough time. And in this case, the morality is pushed a little bit behind. So that's not the kind of the question that we want to ask. So what we want to ask, what is the leaders is doing, whether they perform like charismatic leader mask. Sometimes you look at the Jacinda Ardern and she plays a role as mourner in chief. So she kind of leading the nation to have this kind of moment by elevating some kind of emotional frequency where people feel like, yeah, we will be in this together. We will cry together, but we will be overcome this event together. Yeah. Is this the time? Okay. Thank you for warning, Achilles. I'll probably move. So there is a very good paper just published by Walter Young. And this is the characteristic of leaders, how you become a leader, moral in chief. Versus, so if the event is low political and low collective impact, you simply visit your affected neighbors and being embodied to them. But in times of high collective impact, you need to be a moral in chief. But if the context is just like now, what happens right now under COVID, you need to be kind of playing an orchestra. It means that you have to be capitalizing everything. Now, in one of the case studies that I use in my classroom is Rudy Giuliani. And you know that Rudy Giuliani is a controversial guy. Used to be mayor of New York, quite successful. Used to be unpopular, but somehow gained popularity after 9/11 because he performed very well, kind of displays as a leader. And Hannah really from Kennedy School wrote this case as the man and his moment. But if you look at the way the government tried to understand about leaders, I think actually government didn't talk much about leaders, but humans in general. So it's me who put the leaders. So in government's framework, we can think that leaders in their moment is probably not quite right. So what is actually happens is the moments and their performers, in this case, leaders. So what I'm going to think about for the future is trying to create some kind of leadership based on Goffman's theory, the presentation of leadership in time of crisis using the framework that he did. Now, this is the final stage. I hope I can finish this in 2 minutes. Now I argue why COVID-19 goes wide. I just wrote an op-ed with Miranda Booth at CDU. We argue that at the moment we are quite unlucky at the global stage because of the bad timing of COVID. it happens at a time when there is void in global leadership space. And the reason is because of the rise of popular leaders and populism around the globe. And we can show you dozens or tens of examples of popular leadership that have been quoted by some of the colleagues from political science and also social science. And we argue that populism often became trapped in their optimistic bias. So as a result, they will always delay their decision making because they often think that the events might go away anytime soon until it is too late. And the second is they are victims of their own games because of disinformation or misinformation strategy that they often use. And this will actually clouds their crisis communications and leadership. And very often they are anti-science. And you can see this from Brazil to the US to Indonesia. Ignorance to science at a time when they needed it most is kind of the normal kind of situation that we have been viewing for some times now. And the last thing that we argue is the decline of the US paternalism in the global stage. Unlike the 2014 Ebola pandemic, where the US stand up and put some resources and also take the lead, we don't have that at the moment. So as a result, leaders, everybody is kind of waiting. You see Chinese stand up and trying to help the world, but their leadership suffer from low legitimacy because people think that they have mixed feelings or mixed motives about playing down what they have been doing in Taiwan and so on. So the last thing that I also observe is long transition in decentralization that led to inability of local leaders to exercise their autonomy in governing in times of crisis. And I'll explain that later if you have some questions around that. Otherwise, sorry for the overtime. Akiras, returning to you.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Lassa, for your presentation and talk on crisis leadership in the current context as well. In the interest of time, I understand that only 4 minutes to close the session, rather 2. And there are 3 people who made comments in the chat room. Dr. Lassa, you can have a look at it. Steve Jenkins, Emilianus, and Herman. Can you take 30 seconds or maybe 1 minute each, Steve, Emilianus, and Herman, to please briefly narrate your point of view? I guess most of your chat comments are more of a comment rather than a question, but there are some questions as well. Steve, I start with you.
Thank you, Aklesh. I just put a question out there, and my comments relate to the effectiveness of the leadership in Australia in particular, but that can be compared to other countries around the world based on political systems and the effectiveness of the leader and that sort of thing, whether the crisis was managed too much as just a health crisis as opposed to an actual emergency disaster, and therefore they were too slow to implement the actual disaster management strategies.
Dr. Lassa.
Hi, Steve. I think it's a comment. I think my take on that is, since I'm using government theory, I think at this point of time, we don't have enough time to tell leaders to learn from the normative ideal crisis management kind of knowledge. But I think what I'm suggesting is you can start very poorly at the moment, but at this point of time, it's time for the leaders to be able to, in a way, in quotation, fake themselves in a way that, seen as kind of right crisis leadership practice. Yes, but they have to be able to do that in masterful, playful kind of approach. So impression management is necessary, and at this time of time, I'm trying to be pragmatic here. Of course, we expect leaders to be truly one that is honest and then ideals. But, I'm not trying to get into specific cases here, but I'm trying to suggest some kind of frameworks that leaders could actually pick up and improve their performance at stage.
Thanks, Jonathan. Emilianos, can you also use microphone to briefly summarize your questions?
Oh yeah, so Emiliano is asking questions about populism and socialism in dealing with COVID.
Yeah, I actually would like to ask Pak Jonatan Lassa to explain about how are the differences between populism leadership and socialism leadership in dealing with COVID-19 nowadays. Because what I read from the newspapers, they are having different approaches in dealing with this problem. That's the first question. The second question is, how do political economic contexts shape leadership in times of crisis?
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you, Emilio. So the first questions on populism versus socialism. What are the differences in times of crisis? Well, whether you take capitalism or socialism, they have their own ways and rituals on building evidence and using evidence to inform their decision making. What we are arguing here is populism don't care about knowledge. They don't care about evidence. So what they care about is the performance, and they don't think about long-term implication of that. But if you look at the way Donald Trump have been trying to do, he got high approval ratings after some weeks of, he can actually gain more votes. I mean, if you do the election now, he might be winning again simply because he performed very badly in the beginning, but somehow he kind of get the tune of the public. I mean, some fraction of the public, So whether it's socialism or whether it's different type of economic models that have been used, what we pay attention is the use of evidence and how the evidence is presented versus the populism who don't care anything about, the rightfulness of public policy making in times of disasters. And I think you asked also about the political economic measures of countries in regards to COVID. I think at this point of time, we come from crisis leadership studies or crisis management studies. We don't care much about the economic system because you cannot change that in the middle of the crisis. It's kind of a big train, heavily moving to a certain direction, and we are trying to stop that in the middle of the crisis. It's kind of very hard to do. I mean, imagining a big bus that lost its kind of brake and moving down towards a river, and we have nothing to do apart from waiting it to be collapsed. So I'm not actually we are not paying attention to that because that's not important at the moment because we cannot change that. So what we suggest in here is rather pragmatic. We ask the leaders to change their presentation because somehow people need that at this point of time, and some of the leaders perform better than the others. I think that's the response from me. Sorry if that is not really satisfying. Also.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Lassa. Next is Herman. Herman, do you like to ask a question?
Good morning from Kupang. John, Salom, and then everybody. How are you? My question is, I would like to touch on when you say that you need a crisis leadership. To me, the crisis leadership is something the same as normal leaders, but the situation is different. It's coming to happen that it's abnormal system. But you need the same style of the leadership if you want to make decision. But it starts from a good motivation, I think. If you don't have a good motivation, like the many governments in around the world, then you won't come up with an effective solution. As well as you need to have a solidarity with your people. And then also enough exposures. Then you can make a good decision. And then this effective decision building up the confidence. And then this also help you to gain the trust from the people. So that's why I would go that before have a crisis leadership, you need to have like, good motivation, or sorry, assumptions before that. I think just that.
Thank you, Pak Herman. I think, again, this is how we use lenses to understand how leaders perform in times of crisis. So I agree with you that in that the same leaders perform in the same quality, but in different contexts. But it's not only that. And you seem to be very idealistic about leaders. In my case, in this time of crisis, you don't have to wait for an angel to govern us. I mean, we simply try to fix something that is going on at the moment. And one of the elements of doing that is the leaders. And as you suggest, they need to create some kind of legitimacy. They need to create some kind of compassion and, trying to connect with the citizens in a way that is productive for the whole society. So in this case, we are actually suggesting that you need to be manipulative to some degree, but authentic at the same time. So it's kind of fixing the bad performance in the first stage, but you gain the trust from the audience after you improve as times goes on, So for me, it's like an academic trying to suggest something in the middle of the crisis. And I think government approach is pretty much pragmatic and necessary and needed at this point of time. But of course, it's very hard to do that. We always trap in the idealistic view that leaders should be someone that is, consistent from the very beginning to the end. It doesn't mean that they don't have weakness. We agree on that. But I think at this point of time, what I'm asking is there any better frameworks to help leaders to perform better, even though they started poorly? So that's the angle where I'm coming from at the moment.
Thank you.
Hi everyone. As my colleague Bindi reminded that if you have other commitments, you can certainly leave now. But still, if you have questions, please send an email to Dr. Lassa. His email is provided in the chat room. But those of you who would still like to stay and interact with Dr. Lassa in this Zoom meeting, you can stay and keep asking questions. We'll close the seminar as soon as we finish this Q&A session. Anybody else who would like to give comment or ask questions?
Yeah, I think Drew talked about WHO gave very poor advice. They were starting early in the piece. There was no human-to-human transmission. I mean, in crisis, is that a typical features because of the uncertainty of the events. And as we carry on moving forward, we know better than before. So in this case, what I suggest is we cannot construct WHO as one particular identity that is either ideal or bad in the beginning, and that keeps carry on to the end. What I suggest is they have to be able to fix their impression management system in a way that gain legitimacy after that. like, and make the public understood that there is high degree of uncertainty in a COVID-like event, because it's not easy. I think even for scientists, I consider myself as kind of scientist, social science, but we learn from COVID as the crisis move on. So it's kind of work in progress for everyone, and the science of COVID is a work in progress as well. So that is it. Back to you, Prof. Surgeon.
Thank you. Anyone else who would like to ask any question or make any comment? Well, if not, I would like to thank everyone again for joining this second seminar in the series of Don't Panic seminars.